She did not flinch when he read it aloud. She had known it would come to this. She had simply hoped it would not be in front of everyone. The candles in the great hall of Ashverne Park had been burning long enough that the wax had begun to run in thin pale rivers down the silver holders, leaving tracks that nobody had thought to address. The light they threw was warm and unsteady, and it caught every face in that room. The county wives, the gentleman near the fireplace, the parlour maid frozen at the doorway with a tray she had forgotten she was holding, and made them all look like people watching something they would describe in whispered detail for the remainder of the winter. Eleanor Vane stood in the centre of the hall. She was not weeping, she was not trembling. She was holding a folded letter in both hands and breathing in the careful, measured way of someone who has decided, with everything she has, that she will not fall apart in front of these people. The Duke of Ashverne stood 10 feet away. His arms were at his sides. His face was the face of a man who has received a verdict and is deciding in real time what to do with it. Not fury, something more controlled than fury, something that lived behind his eyes and had no name she could put to it yet. Between them was the name, her father's name, his enemy's name. The name she had carried into this house like luggage she had not known was full of stones. And the Duke of Ashverne looked at Eleanor Vane with an expression that was not fury, and not contempt, and not grief. It was a man deciding, a man standing at the edge of a choice, making up his mind. Before we go any further, if you are already leaning forward, already needing to know what happens next, then you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Whispered Thrones is where every story is told all the way through. No cliffhangers abandoned, no endings cut short. Subscribe if you haven't already. We would love to have you here. Now let me take you back. Before that letter, before that hall, before Eleanor Vane ever set foot in Derbyshire, let me take you to where this began, to a bargain that neither of them fully understood when they made it. Eleanor Margaret Vane was 24 years old, and she had not slept a full night in 2 years. This is not a detail she would have offered to anyone. Eleanor did not speak about the things she was carrying. She managed them. There was a distinction, and it mattered enormously to her. She was gentry on the surface. Minor landed gentry from Wiltshire, education, bearing, manners, and none of the resources that were supposed to accompany those things. The Vane family had been respectable once, in the quiet way of small landowners. For the first 18 years of Eleanor's life, the appearance and the reality had approximately matched each other. Then Sir Aldous Vane had discovered card tables, and the disintegration had begun. Not suddenly, which would almost have been kinder, but slowly, conducted entirely behind closed doors, while Eleanor decided, without anyone asking her to, that everything would appear perfectly fine for as long as she could arrange it. For 6 years, she had been the invisible engine of a household in collapse. She negotiated with creditors in letters Sir Aldous signed without reading. She sold her mother's smaller jewels quietly, through a discreet shop in Bath. She taught music lessons to village children and described the fee as charitable donations, because the word fee would have been intolerable. Every evening, after her sisters were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table. Not the drawing room, the kitchen, because the kitchen fire was cheaper, and opened her small black ledger and wrote the figures down. Every number, every debt, every interest payment. She had been doing this for 2 years. The numbers were never as good as she needed them to be. She wrote them anyway, because looking away from the truth cost more than the truth itself. The situation broke in a single week in September of 1816. Sir Aldous lost what remained of the Wiltshire property in a card game. The house, the land, the small income it had still been producing, gone in an evening. The man who won it was Julian Pemberton, Duke of Ashverne. Eleanor would find out later that this was not as accidental as it appeared. She did not know that yet. What she knew, sitting across from her father while her mother wept quietly in the corner, and her sisters pretended to do needlework, was that the ground had simply been removed from beneath them. The Duke sent a solicitor. The solicitor offered an arrangement. In exchange for the hand of Sir Aldous Vane's eldest daughter, the debt would be settled, a small annual income provided, the family kept whole. He had never met Eleanor. He had not asked her name. Sir Aldous agreed before telling her. Eleanor did not cry when she found out. She sat very still and put both hands flat on the arms of her chair and breathed slowly, the way she had taught herself to breathe when the thing happening was too large to respond to immediately. She thought about her sisters. She thought about the ledger and what the figures would look like if she refused. She thought about what situations looked like for girls without money or connections. She had seen enough of them to know exactly what that meant, and the knowledge was not abstract to her. Then she said, "I will need to write to the solicitor. I have questions about the terms." Her voice was even. Her hands were still. She had made her decision before anyone had thought to ask for one. She asked her questions. She packed her trunk. On a Tuesday morning in October she set out for Derbyshire, and she did not look back at the house as the coach pulled away. Julian Pemberton, Duke of Ashverne, was 33 and had spent 5 years building a life so precisely ordered that the silence inside it had become indistinguishable from strength. He was decisive, or rather, he had made decisiveness into architecture, because uncertainty produced in him something he had never named and never examined. When things were ambiguous, he chose a position, held it, did not revisit it. This had served him extraordinarily well in the management of 12,000 acres, 4 tenant villages, and a colliery interest. It had served him less well in everything else. 5 years before Eleanor arrived, Julian had trusted someone. He had trusted Sir Aldous Vane, his friend, or something close enough to friendship that the distinction had not seemed to matter, with the intelligence of a land acquisition. Aldous had sold the intelligence to a rival investor named Grenby, who purchased the parcel first and had been leasing it back to Julian at punishing terms ever since. The financial cost was real. The other cost, of having been the kind of man who trusted someone, and having been shown what that produced, was the one he still carried without naming. On the evening Carew laid the Vane agreement on his desk, Julian stood at the window with a glass of port he had not touched. Then he turned, read the name at the top of the document, set it down, and said in a voice of absolute neutrality, "When does she arrive?" He did not ask what she looked like. He asked when, because when was the only question he had decided to let matter. Carew gave him the date and withdrew. The port sat untouched. The grounds lay dark and enormous and quiet. She heard him before she saw him. The entrance hall of Ashverne Park on a Tuesday morning in October was large enough to swallow her family's Wiltshire cottage whole. Eleanor was carrying her own bag. Her one footman had gone ahead to settle with the coach driver. When she looked up at the ceiling fresco, gave it exactly 3 seconds, and brought her eyes down across the hall. He was crossing from one door to another, and registered the outer door, and turned. She had constructed on the journey a version of the Duke she could manage, older, blunter, more obviously transactional, so the transaction would feel less humiliating. The actual Duke was none of those things. He was composed and dark-eyed, and looking at her with the precise attention of someone accustomed to examining things until he understood them. The version she had built dissolved. She would have to deal with the actual man. Julian crossed the hall and stopped before her. He looked at the bag in her hand and said, without warmth but also without cruelty, "You should have been met at the county road. I'll speak with Carew." Then he took the bag from her hand, not dramatically, simply because it was there and she was holding it, and passed it to the nearest footman. Eleanor did not know what to do with this. It was not exactly kindness. It was attention to a detail no one had told him to notice. She filed it away. She would take it out and look at it later, alone. 3 weeks into her residence, she and Julian had settled into a careful daily proximity. Breakfasting together, occasionally walking the grounds, navigating the drawing room in the evenings, in a way that had begun to feel, in Eleanor's private assessment, almost companionable. She was not foolish enough to call it more than that. But she had begun to breathe slightly more easily. Then the first letter arrived. It was from her father. Sir Aldous wrote, on the surface, with paternal solicitude. The last paragraph made her cold. Lord Grenby, the man who had purchased the land from under Julian 5 years ago, had approached Sir Aldous. Grenby knew where Eleanor was. He knew the terms. And he had asked Sir Aldous to make inquiries through Eleanor about certain matters pertaining to Ashverne's western holdings. She was being asked to spy. Her own father, in language that never used the word, was asking her to betray the man she had come here to marry. She understood with horrible clarity that if Julian discovered a letter asking this of her had arrived while she was living under his roof, it would not matter that she intended to refuse. The name she carried would be all the evidence he needed. She asked the housekeeper, carefully, framing it as innocent interest in the estate's history, about the Western holdings. Mrs. Foyle told her enough. Julian's betrayal 5 years ago had not merely cost him a parcel of land. He had trusted someone, and that trust had been used as a commodity. She was beginning to understand why he had arranged for a wife through a solicitor, why the house was full of order and absence of warmth. He was not simply cold, he was protected. Eleanor wrote back to her father in terms that were superficially compliant, but contained nothing of value. Pleasant generalities about the grounds and the autumn weather, absolutely no intelligence about Julian's business. She burned her father's letter and told herself this was strategy. She knew it was also fear. She did not yet know if Julian would believe her, and she could not afford to lose this before it had become anything. On a rainy afternoon 6 weeks into her residence, searching for writing paper in the small library adjacent to her rooms, Eleanor found a journal wedged behind a shelf of estate records. It had slipped and fallen and been forgotten. She opened it and found it was not a household record. It was kept by the previous Duchess of Ashverne, Julian's mother, who had died when Julian was 19. She read enough to understand its contents before she stopped herself. The previous Duchess wrote about a boy of 17 who left portions of his dinner at the kitchen door for tenant children he knew were underfed, without telling anyone, without taking credit, who taught himself the estate accounts at 16 because his father was dissolute and someone had to, who sat with his mother for 6 weeks when she was ill and read to her every afternoon. There was one sentence Eleanor read 3 times. "My son will become a great man, and I am afraid the greatness will eat what is gentle in him. I hope he finds someone who can see past the armor to what he built it to protect." Eleanor put the journal carefully back where she had found it. She did not tell Julian she had found it, but she understood something she had not prepared to understand. His coldness was not indifference. It was what happened to a boy with a decent, quiet heart when the world kept showing him that openness was a liability. She was in danger and she knew it, not from him, from herself. She was beginning to see past the armor, and she could not afford to. The problem was that she could not afford not to. The county dinner came in mid-November. 8 families, meant as an introduction, conducted with the careful politeness of people assessing something they have not yet decided how to categorize. Lord Grenby arrived among the guests. He had angled an invitation through a mutual acquaintance, with a wife and a smile that did not reach his eyes. Across the table he addressed Eleanor with intimacy too specific to be innocent. "Miss Vane, soon to be Miss Vane no longer, I understand. We are old friends of your family. How is your dear father?" The emphasis on your dear father was almost nothing, but Eleanor heard it. Julian heard it. The room heard the weight in it without being told to. The morning after, Julian did not speak to Eleanor at breakfast. She sat across the long table from him and watched him read his correspondence and understood that this was not anger. She had spent enough weeks learning to read him to know the difference. This was withdrawal. The thing he did when something produced uncertainty in him. He pulled inward, went very still, and processed it alone, as though processing with another person were a skill he had simply never been taught. She let it run until midday. Then she sought him out and asked, directly and without softening, whether the events of the previous evening had changed what was agreed between them. He looked at her for a long moment, the look of a man choosing his words with precision, and said, "The situation remains as it was agreed." The situation. As if she were a clause in a contract. As if the 6 weeks she had spent at this table, in this house, learning the shape of him, had produced nothing that required a different noun. She nodded, she said thank you, she left. That evening, for the first time since arriving at Ashverne, she opened her black ledger and stared at the figures without writing anything. A second letter arrived from her father. This one dropped the pleasant framing. Grenby was pressing. Sir Aldous owed Grenby money separately. Of course he did, and Grenby had made clear that debt would be called in unless Eleanor assisted. Sir Aldous wrote, "You are clever, my dear. Surely this costs nothing." Eleanor sat with the letter for an entire afternoon. She considered, genuinely considered, what it would mean to give Grenby something small and useless. She burned the letter, but the consideration left a mark. She had looked into that room and found she was capable of opening the door. Grenby found a pretext to call at the estate and managed, with the particular skill of a man who has long practice at engineering coincidences, to encounter Eleanor alone in the rose garden for approximately 4 minutes. He was pleasant, almost charming. His manner suggested that what he was proposing was the most reasonable thing in the world. "A simple matter of practicality between adults," he said. "You strike me as a practical woman, Miss Vane. Elegant solutions sometimes benefit from more than one patron." He left before Julian appeared, smoothly, without urgency, as though he had simply stopped to admire the November roses. Eleanor stood in the garden after he had gone, and breathed the cold air, and said nothing to no one. She had no one to tell. That was the particular quality of the position she was in. She was surrounded by people, and she was completely alone in it. She told no one. 2 months into Eleanor's residence, Julian discovered the truth. He had instructed Carew to investigate Grenby's interest in the estate. What Carew returned with was more than he had asked for. A letter from Grenby to Sir Aldous, intercepted through a banking contact, revealed the full scope. The card game had been engineered. Grenby had arranged for Sir Aldous to be in that game, knowing Julian held his notes, knowing Julian would offer the debt-for-daughter arrangement. Grenby's goal was to place Vane's inside Ashverne with a manufactured obligation to her father, a pressure point, a spy he could develop at leisure. Julian read this carefully. Then Carew placed one more document on the desk. His household, as a matter of estate security, recorded all letters sent from Ashverne. Eleanor's 2 letters to her father were there. Both contained nothing of value: weather, grounds, household pleasantries. The second letter ended with a sentence Carew read aloud because Julian's eyes had stopped moving. "I will not be what you are asking me to be. I am asking you not to ask again." She had refused, alone under pressure without telling anyone, for weeks. Julian sat for a long time after Carew withdrew. He had spent 5 years holding a conviction. No one connected to Sir Aldous Vane could be trusted. He had held it so long it had become structural, load-bearing, part of what kept him upright. Eleanor's conduct had been dismantling it piece by piece for 2 months, and he had watched it being dismantled and responded by pulling away. Because a man who has built his interior life on not being wrong does not know how to accommodate evidence that he has been. He said nothing to her. He spent 4 days saying nothing, which was not a neutral act. On the evening of the 4th day, a letter arrived at Ashverne, delivered publicly on a silver tray, carried into the drawing room by a footman in front of 3 county families who had called that evening, addressed to Miss Vane. Grenby had found the final pressure point. He had made the delivery a performance. Eleanor took the letter from the tray. She knew from the handwriting whose hand had delivered it to her father. She opened it and read it in 10 seconds. Then she folded it. She held it in her hand. She looked across the room at Julian. He was watching her face. Eleanor Vane walked toward him. The room quietened without being asked to. She stopped before him, close enough that the room could not hear if she did not want to be heard, and she said, in a voice that was completely controlled and completely, irreversibly done with managing alone, "I want to tell you what this letter is. I have wanted to tell you since the first one arrived 8 weeks ago, and I did not, because I was afraid of what you would assume. I am telling you now, because I am more afraid of being the person who lets fear make the choice than I am of you." And she told him everything, not in pieces, not hedged. Grenby's approach, her father's 2 letters, what had been asked, what she refused. Why she said nothing. She did not make herself a hero in the telling. She acknowledged, looking directly into his face, that she had sat with the compromise for an entire afternoon and understood she was capable of choosing it. She acknowledged that silence had been in part cowardice. She waited. The room was very quiet. She was aware of it the way you are aware of weather. As an atmosphere surrounding her, a pressure she was choosing not to feel. Then she said, "I did not come here to be your enemy's instrument. I came here because my family had no other option, and neither did I. But I will not be used, not by him, not by my father, and not by you. If you have decided I am a liability rather than a person, I would like to know now, because I am very tired of being assessed, and I would like to stop." She held out the letter and placed it in his hand. Then she stepped back 1 step, not retreating, giving him room. She had said what there was to say, the rest was his. Julian looked at the letter. He looked at her. The silence had weight. Then he said very quietly, "I know." She did not understand it yet. She stood still and watched his face. He turned to the room, every face angled at an angle, pretending not to be angled at them, and said in a voice that carried, "Good evening. I believe we have had quite enough county visiting for tonight." The room cleared in minutes. When they were alone, he turned back to Eleanor, who had not moved. "Come with me," he said. "There is something I should have told you 3 days ago." In his study, he spread the documents before her without softening any of it. The engineered card game, the full shape of Grenby's scheme. He gave her the complete picture because she had earned it, and because withholding it further would be a lie he could no longer make. Then he said, "I read your letters. My household records all correspondence as a matter of estate security. I knew before tonight what you wrote to your father." Eleanor looked at him. "I knew before you told me," he said, "and I said nothing for 4 days, because I did not know how to be wrong about something I had been certain of for 5 years." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the way figures always had to be looked at exactly as they were before anything useful could be done about them. Then she said, "Then we are even. I was afraid to tell you, and you were afraid to trust what you already knew. We have both been managing this incorrectly." Something in his face shifted. Not a breaking of anything, more like a wall acknowledging, for the first time, that it no longer needs to hold the weight it was built to carry. "Yes," he said, "we have." There was a long quiet after that, not the silence of two people who have nothing to say, but the silence of two people who have said more than they planned to, and are letting it settle. Eleanor looked at the documents spread across the desk. She looked at the man who had spread them, who was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, careful and a little uncertain, which on Julian Pemberton's face was as close to vulnerable as anything she expected to witness. She thought about the kitchen ledger. She thought about precision, and about the way figures always had to be looked at exactly as they were before anything could be done about them. She thought this was, in its own way, the same. She did not learn what he did next until Carew told her 3 days later. Julian had ridden to the neighbouring property where Grenby was staying. He had informed Grenby, briefly and privately, that the intercepted letter proving the card game had been engineered would be delivered to Grenby's banker, his solicitor, and 2 members of the House of Lords. Should Grenby contact any member of the Vane family again, or approach Ashverne by any means. He had made no theatre of it. He simply used the only currency he had. Power, absolute and consequential, in a way that served Eleanor specifically and did nothing for his own advancement. He had not told her. She heard it from Carew, who considered it estate business she was entitled to know. Eleanor stood at the window of her sitting room for a long time after Carew left. She thought about what it meant to have someone exercise care without performing it. She thought about the boy in the journal who left food at kitchen doors without telling anyone. The distance between the man that boy had become and the man he had always been underneath. Waiting for somewhere safe enough to exist. She did not cry. She was not, by nature, a woman who cried easily, and she had learned early that tears required an audience, and she had never been in the habit of providing one for herself. But she stood at the window of her sitting room for a very long time, looking out at the grounds. Dark, enormous, perfectly managed, and she felt something shift in the very deepest part of the structure she had built to stay upright. Something that had been load-bearing for 6 years quietly, without acknowledgement. She recognized it. She decided to let it. Eleanor Margaret Vane married Julian Aldrich Pemberton, Duke of Ashverne, at the end of November 1816, in the estate chapel with 12 witnesses and no ceremony beyond the essential. She declined the Pemberton family diamonds in favour of a simple strand of pearls that had belonged to her own mother. The pearls were not spectacular, they were hers. Walking back through the grounds afterward in the first light snow of winter, she became aware of something she identified carefully, privately, as peace, not happiness. Happiness was still too large a word for a woman who had been managing crises for 6 years and had not yet learned what it was to stop. But peace. The ground beneath her feet was stable. She had never been offered just enough before, and she found, to her own surprise, that just enough was considerable. Her mother and sisters were provided for, the debts settled quietly, permanently. Her mother, freed from the worst of her fear, began to improve in health. Eleanor kept the ledger. She brought it with her to Ashfern and kept it in the desk in her sitting room. But the figures were different now. Julian did not become a different man. He became a more complete version of the one he had always been, still decisive, still controlled. But Eleanor had introduced a fissure in the armour, and through it small things emerged. He ate breakfast more slowly. He began asking her opinion on estate matters, and received it with the full attention it deserved. Mrs. Foyle observed him, standing in the library doorway on a Tuesday in December, watching Eleanor read, doing nothing at all except standing there. She told the kitchen maid. The kitchen maid told everyone. That winter he also began renegotiating the lease on the western parcel. It took 2 years and cost him considerably. He did it anyway. Lord Grenby, finding his leverage gone and his correspondence known to 2 members of the Lords, declined to contest it and retreated from Derbyshire entirely. No one noted his absence with any grief. Here is what this story was actually about. Underneath the debts and the letters and the enemy's name, underneath the county dinners and the engineered card games and the folded letters brought in on silver trays in front of rooms full of witnesses. It was about what happens when 2 people who have learned to survive by not needing anyone are placed in a situation where not needing anyone stops being enough. Eleanor Vane arrived at Ashverne carrying the name of a man Julian Pemberton could not trust. She stayed, which is its own kind of leaving everything behind, and she carried her own name forward. Which was the one that mattered all along? If you came here for a love story, I hope you found one, but I think you also came for something else. For a woman who did not have to burn herself down to be worth knowing. For the moment, always the moment, when someone finally sees you clearly and does not look away. That moment is always worth the wait. If this story gave you something, he was exactly the kind of listener Whispered Thrones was made for. Subscribe and stay. We tell these stories all the way through, every time. And if you don't, well, you will simply have to carry the weight of wondering how the next one ends. That seems like unnecessary work for someone as clever as you. On an evening in late December, Eleanor sat at the desk in her sitting room. Her sitting room now, not borrowed space, with the small black ledger open before her. The fire was lit. Julian came in without knocking, which he had recently started doing, and she did not look up immediately. He looked at the ledger, which she did not close. He asked, "Better or worse than last week?" She looked up at him. "Better," she said. He sat in the chair across from her, and they remained like that. 2 people in a room that had finally become large enough for both of them. In the firelight, the numbers better than they had ever been. That is where we leave her. That is exactly where she would want to be left.